The studio lights burned hot and white, a halo of intensity over the CNN stage. Cameras locked in, red tally lights glowing, the world watching. Anderson Cooper leaned slightly forward at his desk, poised between two titans from very different worlds. On one side sat Alan Dershowitz, 85 years old, Harvard Law emeritus, the man who had defended presidents, celebrities, and dictators with equal fervor. His tie was sharp, his smile sharper. His voice carried the weight of decades spent as America's most notorious legal pugilist. On the other side sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, younger, calmer, her posture straight but relaxed, her eyes steady. She wasn't just a politician. She was a trial lawyer who had spent years in courtrooms where the stakes were measured in human lives, not academic prestige. And then it happened. Dershowitz tilted his head, lips curling into a patronizing grin. He leaned toward the microphone with a chuckle that sounded less like humor and more like dismissal. "Congresswoman," he said, pausing just long enough to let the condescension sink in. "You may want to dust off those old law school notes. Clearly, some of the finer points of constitutional law have escaped you." The words hung in the air like smoke. Anderson Cooper shifted uncomfortably. The studio audience drew a collective breath. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't roll her eyes or interrupt. She simply stared back, her silence sharper than any immediate retort. This wasn't just a clash of opinions. This was a clash of eras, the aging lion of the ivory tower versus the rising voice of a new generation. Ego against composure, arrogance against preparation. Viewers across America leaned closer to their screens. Some grinned at the audacity of Dershowitz's jab. Others bristled, waiting for Crockett's response. The tension wasn't just intellectual, it was visceral. For a moment, it seemed like the professor had landed his blow cleanly, that his decades of courtroom swagger had silenced a challenger half his age. But Crockett's eyes told a different story. Calm, focused, calculating. The smile on Dershowitz's face widened. Convinced he had won the room, he hadn't. Because what Jasmine Crockett did next would not only shift the balance of the debate, it would leave Alan Dershowitz, America's most seasoned legal provocateur, utterly speechless. The panel wasn't supposed to be explosive. At least that's what CNN producers told themselves in the pre-show meeting. A roundtable on executive privilege sounded dry, academic, the kind of topic only law students and political junkies obsess over. But they underestimated what happens when theory collides with raw political power. Anderson Cooper sat at the center like a referee, his trademark calm smile giving way to tight-lipped seriousness. He knew exactly what was at stake. To the left of him, Alan Dershowitz radiated authority, his resume stretching longer than most legal textbooks. Harvard law professor, his counsel to presidents, a fixture on every cable news network for decades. Too many viewers? He was untouchable, the oracle of constitutional law. To Anderson's right sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, younger, untested on a national stage and underestimated by almost everyone in the room. The whispers before the broadcast were telling. She's good in hearings, sure, but this is Dershowitz. No one schools Dershowitz. But the subject tonight was no academic parlor game. This was about the beating heart of American democracy. Executive privilege, the idea that presidents can withhold information from Congress or the courts. How far does that shield extend? Can it protect misconduct? Can it silence oversight? Can it warp accountability itself? Dershowitz wasted no time laying down his case. He invoked history with sweeping gestures, quoting framers and precedents, as if they were personal friends. His voice carried the cadence of authority, part lecture, part sermon. His argument was simple, but chilling. The presidency requires maximum protection, sphere of secrecy almost beyond question. Crockett listened, patient, deliberate, the way a trial lawyer listens when the prosecution thinks they've already won. She let him finish, nodding occasionally, even smiling faintly. But her stillness was strategy, not surrender. Asterisk, because Crockett knew what millions of Americans watching at home felt deep in their bones. Unchecked power corrodes everything. President shielded from accountability isn't a leader. He's a a king, and kings don't answer to the people. The air in the studio thickened as the discussion turned sharper. Dershowitz interrupted freely, cutting off Crockett mid-sentence with a wave of his hand, his voice dripping with that professorial dismissal. "That's not how the law works, Congresswoman." Anderson shifted again, visibly uncomfortable. Crockett stayed locked in. No eye rolls, no exasperation. Just measured calm, like a chess player waiting for the board to open. The stakes weren't just constitutional theory. They were political survival. This debate echoed into every corner of government. Oversight committees, special counsels, impeachment hearings. Whoever won tonight didn't just score points on television, they framed the narrative for the next national crisis. Viewers at home felt the divide. Some cheered Dershowitz's bravado. Others saw in Crockett the grit of someone who'd fought in real courtrooms, not lecture halls. Twitter feeds buzzed, hashtags formed. The tension was no longer confined to the studio. It was pulsing across the country, and beneath it all lay a larger truth. This wasn't just a generational clash or an ego contest. It was a referendum on how America defines its own checks and balances. If Dershowitz's vision prevailed, presidents gained a shield that could eclipse accountability. If Crockett's voice cut through, the Constitution would remain a living contract with the people, not a privilege reserved for the powerful. And that's why every pause, every exchange, every smirk, and every silence mattered. Because this wasn't just a debate. It was about who gets to define the SUE, its Constitution for America's future. To understand the electricity of that night, you have to understand Alan Dershowitz. For half a century, his name was synonymous with constitutional combat. He rose quickly through Harvard Law, a prodigy who became the youngest professor in the school's history. His lectures were legendary, fiery, theatrical, more courtroom performance than classroom instruction. Students didn't just take his courses. They survived them, emerging either galvanized or scorched. But Dershowitz wasn't content to remain cloistered in academia. He craved the spotlight. The 1980s and 90s saw him transform into something rare, a lawyer as famous as his clients. Mike Tyson, O.J. Simpson. Claus von Bülow Dershowitz made defending the controversial not just a practice but a brand. He reveled in the chaos, delighting in the role of America's courtroom contrarian. Television adored him. Panels, interviews, op-eds, Dershowitz was everywhere. His voice carried authority but also arrogance. He didn't just argue, he dismissed. Opponents weren't just wrong, they were ignorant, naive, or in need of his unsolicited lecture on what the law really says. Over time, the smirk became as recognizable as the name. Asterisk, and then came politics. In 1998, during Bill Clinton's impeachment, Dershowitz declared that impeachment was a political tool that a president could be impeached even without committing a statutory crime. The framers, he argued then, gave Congress broad power. His words were crisp, forceful, unambiguous. Fast forward to 2020 and the script flipped. Standing on the Senate floor during Donald Trump's impeachment trial, Dershowitz thundered the opposite. Impeachment, he now claimed, required criminal conduct. No crime? No removal? When confronted with his earlier position, he brushed it aside as academic musing. The contradictions piled up. What was once conviction began to look like convenience. His legal interpretations shifted with the winds of politics, but his certainty never wavered. He was always right, even when he contradicted himself. To critics, this wasn't scholarship, it was opportunism. To Dershowitz, it was survival. The defense of a legacy built not on consistency, but on visibility. Every TV spot, every book deal, every viral quote kept him in the conversation. For a man in his twilight years, obscurity was the real enemy. Yet with each pivot, the arrogance grew. He waved away critics as uninformed. He mocked opponents as amateurs. He framed every clash not as a debate, but as a teaching moment. With himself at the podium, his adversary reduced to a struggling student, that's what made his clash with Jasmine Crockett so combustible. To him, she wasn't an equal on that stage. She was another student in need of correction, another novice to be reminded of the professor's superiority. But here was the blind spot. Crockett wasn't a law student fumbling through hypotheticals. She wasn't an academic towing the line of theory. She was a trial lawyer who had argued real cases before real judges with real consequences. Her understanding of the Constitution wasn't carved in ivory towers. It was sharpened in the trenches of litigation and oversight. Asterisk for all his brilliance, Dershowitz couldn't see it. Couldn't imagine being challenged, much less undone by someone younger, someone outside the club of Harvard and elite panels. Someone he had already written off as inferior. That's the thing about arrogance. It shields you from doubt but blinds you to danger. It convinces you that every past victory guarantees the next one. It whispers that reputation is armor, that credentials are invincible, that age itself is proof of superiority. Asterisk. But arrogance also builds patterns, predictable habits, weak spots waiting to be exploited. And Crockett, underestimated though she was, had studied those patterns. She had done her homework. She knew his contradictions, his reversals, his history of dismissals. She knew that behind the smirk was a record he couldn't defend. The stage was set. The professor had written the same play for decades, and the world had applauded. But this time, the script would not go as planned, because arrogance has a way of creating blind spots. And Jasmine Crockett knew exactly where to strike. Long before the cameras and the clash with Alan Dershowitz, Jasmine Crockett's story began in the heart of Texas. She wasn't born into privilege or legacy. She was raised in a working class family that valued grit over glamour, perseverance over pedigree. For Crockett, the idea of justice wasn't abstract, it was personal. She grew up seeing what happened when ordinary people collided with a system that too often tilted against them. That sense of imbalance fueled her from the beginning. She studied hard, earned her law degree, and walked straight into the trenches of criminal defense. While some classmates chased corporate law firms with glass towers and six-figure salaries, Crockett chose the courthouse hallways where the stakes were measured in human lives, not quarterly profits. Her clients weren't celebrities or CEOs. They were the vulnerable young men accused of crimes they didn't commit, families crushed by an unforgiving system, community members who couldn't afford a lawyer unless someone like her showed up. For Crockett, each case wasn't just a file. It was a person, a story, a fight against being forgotten. Courtrooms are brutal, judges impatient, prosecutors merciless, juries unpredictable. And yet, in that crucible, Crockett found her rhythm. She learned to think quickly, to adjust. Arguments mid-sentence, to stay calm while others tried to rattle her. She built her reputation not on pedigree, but on performance, a lawyer who could stand in front of 12 strangers and make them feel the humanity of the accused sitting silently beside her. But defending the vulnerable isn't just about law, it's about politics. The same inequities she saw in court bled into housing policy, policing, education, and voting rights. Crockett realized that no matter how many cases she argued, the system itself needed changing. That's when she made the leap from courtroom advocate to grassroots politician. Running for office wasn't easy. She didn't have billionaire donors. She didn't have the built-in network of old-guard Texas politics. What she had was community, volunteers who knocked doors, neighbors who printed flyers, families who believed someone who had stood by them in court could also stand by them in Congress. Every handshake, every living room matanned greet, every late-night strategy session carried the same energy as her defense work. A fight for people overlooked by power. By the time she won her seat in Congress, Crockett wasn't just another politician. She was a survivor, a fighter, someone who had walked into courtrooms where everything was stacked against her and found ways to win. That's why. When she prepared for the CNN panel with Alan Dershowitz, she didn't come armed with swagger or bluster. She came with a portfolio of case law, notes highlighted in the margins, and a calm resolve honed from years of being underestimated. She knew what it meant to be talked over. She knew what it felt like to be dismissed. And she knew how to turn both into fuel. Her strength wasn't volume, it was patience. She didn't need to interrupt or condescend. She let others talk themselves into corners. She let arrogance expose itself. And then, with surgical precision, She struck with facts, so sharp they cut through bravado like glass. It was that composure, forged in years of defending the defenseless, that now stood across from Alan Dershowitz. He had a lifetime of accolades. She had a lifetime of battles. He had legacy. She had lived experience. And on that stage, in front of millions, contrast would matter. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't just another panelist. She was the embodiment of every underdog who had been laughed at, ignored, or talked over. And when Dershowitz mocked her credentials, when he smirked at her as though she were just another student fumbling through constitutional hypotheticals, he set the stage for his own undoing. The lights had only grown hotter as the debate stretched. On what had started as polite sparring was now a tug-of-war over the very meaning of the Constitution. Anderson Cooper's eyes darted between the two panelists like a referee in a prize fight, trying to maintain order without dulling the spectacle. Alan Dershowitz leaned forward, voice pitched louder than before, his words cutting across the air. Like a gavel, it stopped addressing the panel, or even Cooper. He was addressing America, slipping back into the role of professor before a captive class. "Let me explain something simple," he said, raising one finger like he was drawing a diagram in the air. Congresswoman Crockett may have enthusiasm, but constitutional law isn't about passion. It's about precision. If she'd like, I'm happy to offer her a remedial education in the finer points of executive privilege. The smirk returned, almost theatrical. A few chuckles rippled from the audience, nervous, half amused, half uncomfortable. Crockett didn't laugh. She didn't roll her eyes. She simply shifted in her chair, straightening her back, resting her hands calmly on the table.
Oh, no.
Tell for those watching closely. It's the narrowing of her eyes and the brief tightening of her jaw. Cooper tried to intervene. "Professor Dershowitz, let's allow," but Dershowitz barreled on, raising his voice. "The Constitution is not a toy for politicians. It is a document for scholars, for jurists who understand its nuance. When I hear arguments like Congresswoman Crockett's, I worry about the future of legal reasoning in this country. We need discipline, not sound bites." The condescension dripped with every word. The power imbalance was palpable, an aging titan. Lecturing a younger woman of color, live on air, as if she were a wayward student. Crockett inhaled slowly. Then she smiled, just faintly, the kind of smile that wasn't amusement but warning. She didn't interrupt. She let him keep talking. She let him pile word upon word, each dripping with the same smugness that had defined his public persona for decades. She knew what millions at home were seeing, and they were already reacting. On Twitter, fingers flew. Remedial education. "Really?" one user posted, adding a facepalm emoji. Another quipped, "Dershowitz, mansplaining constitutional law 101 on live TV." A third stitched together a gif of his smirk with the caption, "Sir, this ain't Harvard, it's CNN. Memes were already forming, spreading faster than the words could leave his mouth. But inside the studio, the energy was heavier, more combustible. Crockett's silence felt less like defeat and more like a storm gathering at the edge of the horizon. Dershowitz, oblivious, doubled down. "Frankly, I expected better preparation. If you're going to come onto a national stage and debate constitutional law, at least do your homework. Otherwise, leave it to those of us who have been shaping the field for 50 years. That was the moment. The condescension had reached its peak, the imbalance pushed to its breaking point. Viewers at home leaned forward. Anderson Cooper opened his mouth to redirect. Even the studio crew, camera operators, producers speaking, urgently in earpieces, sensed the shift coming. Crockett finally lifted her hand, slowly, deliberately, and leaned toward her microphone. Her expression was calm, but her eyes had sharpened into steel. The audience hushed. Cooper froze, Dershowitz still smiling. Clearly expected another attempt he could swat away with a dismissive chuckle. But what came next was not what anyone expected, because in the span of a single sentence, the entire script flipped, and Alan Dershowitz's smirk would vanish. Asterisk the moment Jasmine Crockett leaned toward her microphone. The entire studio seemed to hold its breath. The air, already thick with tension, now felt electric. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't match Alan Dershowitz's volume or condescension. Instead, she began with a composure so steady it was almost unnerving. "Professor," she said softly, "with all due respect, I don't need a remedial education in constitutional law. I've practiced it. I've lived it. I've defended clients whose freedom depended on those same finer points you just referenced." The audience stirred. A murmur rippled across the studio. Crockett glanced briefly toward Anderson Cooper, then back to Dershowitz. Her voice sharpened, still calm, but deliberate. "And since you've questioned my preparation, let's test that." She reached for her notes, a neat folder, pages carefully highlighted. She tapped it once, like a judge calling order in a courtroom, and began. "Executive privilege is not a blank check for presidents. U.S. v. Nixon. 1974 made that clear. The court ruled unanimously, by the way, that no one, not even the president, is above the law. That precedent is the foundation for every conversation we're having today. To ignore it is to ignore history." Asterisk gasps flickered through the crowd. Dershowitz shifted slightly in his chair, but Crockett pressed forward, her cadence quickening like a lawyer in closing arguments. "And if we want to talk about more recent precedent, Trump v. Mazars, 2020. The Supreme Court reaffirmed that Congress has oversight power over the executive. It's not a soundbite, Professor. It's constitutional law, tested at the highest level." She let the words hang. Cooper leaned back, eyebrows raised. Dershowitz opened his mouth to interject, but Crockett cut him off, her tone still polite but unyielding. "And since you've framed yourself as the keeper of consistency, let's look at your own record." She gestured toward the screen behind them. A producer, already cued by her team, rolled the clip. There it was, Dershowitz. During the Clinton impeachment, passionately arguing that abuse of power was an impeachable offense. Clip ended, and another rolled. Dershowitz, during Trump's impeachment, making the exact opposite claim. The audience reacted audibly, gasps, laughter, even a few boos. Cooper glanced at Dershowitz, whose smirk had faltered. Crockett leaned back, allowing the moment to breathe. She didn't gloat. She didn't raise her arms in triumph. She simply let the contrast speak for itself. "Professor," she said finally, "it seems your definition of constitutional law changes depending on who's in power. For the people I represent, that kind of inconsistency isn't academic. It's life and death. It's justice denied." For the first time all evening, Dershowitz's words stumbled. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, began with, "Well, what I meant was..." But Crockett wasn't done. America doesn't need lectures. America needs honesty. And the truth is, constitutional law isn't about protecting presidents or preserving legacies. It's about protecting the people, the very people who don't get invited into Harvard lecture halls. The studio erupted, a mix of applause and stunned silence. Cooper tried to interject, but the moment was already larger than him. Larger than the panel? Camera close-ups caught it all. Dershowitz blinking rapidly, his hand trembling slightly as he shuffled his papers. Crockett, serene, her posture straight, her eyes unwavering. On Twitter, the reaction exploded in real time. Clips of the video receipts went viral within minutes. Hashtags like hashtag Crockett Clapback and hashtag Dershowitz Owned trended globally. Memes of Dershowitz's shifting expressions from smug to stunned spread like wildfire. Back in the studio, the silence after Crockett's final words was deafening. It wasn't the silence of awkwardness. It was the silence of a knockout punch landing so cleanly, the room needed a second to process. Anderson Cooper finally leaned forward, his voice lower, almost reverent. "Congresswoman Crockett, point well made." The camera cut back to Dershowitz, who attempted a half-smile but couldn't summon the confidence behind it. His legendary sharpness, the ability to parry and counterattack, had deserted him because Crockett hadn't just defended herself. She had dismantled him, point by point, precedent by precedent, contradiction by contradiction. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, it was surgical, and in that calm dismantling, the balance of power shifted. For decades, Alan Dershowitz, had been untouchable. The last word in any debate, the voice networks sought when they wanted authority on constitutional law. But in one unforgettable exchange, Jasmine Crockett had turned the tables. She had shown that knowledge wasn't the monopoly of legacy, it's that preparation and lived experience could stand shoulder to shoulder with pedigree and win. The cameras caught Dershowitz fumbling for words, his arguments unraveling in real time. Crockett simply folded her notes, set them aside, and leaned back in her chair. It was the physical embodiment of a mic drop. The audience could feel it. Viewers at home could feel it. Even Dershowitz, deep down, could feel it, because this wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a reckoning, and if the live takedown was shocking, the aftermath was seismic. The debate might have ended in the studio, but the real battle was just beginning. Online, within minutes of Jasmine Crockett's takedown, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram lit up like fireworks. The hashtag Crockett Clapback shot to the top of the trending charts. Clips of her citing US v. Nixon and Trump v. Mazars were shared and reshared with captions like, "This is how you school a so-called expert." On TikTok, creators wasted no time. One popular remix spliced Dershowitz's smirk with Crockett's calm rebuttal, overlaid with the caption, "Confidence versus competence." Another paired her mic drop line about honesty over lectures with a looping bass drop. Within 24 hours, millions had watched, commented, stitched their own reactions. By the next morning, late-night comedians had joined in. On The Daily Show, a mock remedial education skit went viral on its own. On Late Night with Seth Meyers, Dershowitz's contradictions were replayed side by side. With Meyers deadpanning, "Looks like someone needs flashcards." But the virality wasn't just entertainment. Law professors at universities from Yale to Howard tweeted that they planned to play the exchange in class. One even called it a masterclass in composure under fire, a Georgetown student posted. "This is the first time my con law professor assigned a CNN clip as required viewing." The shockwaves, however, hit hardest where it mattered most: Alan Dershowitz's reputation. For decades, Dershowitz had been the untouchable legal pundit, the go-to talking head for constitutional questions. But suddenly networks hesitated. Invitations that once poured in now slowed to a trickle. His upcoming book tour, once expected to be a victory lap, became a liability. At one event in New York, protesters held up signs reading, "Practice what you preach and know. One is above the law." Several stops were quietly canceled. The contrast between the viral clips and his usual media polish was too stark. His insistence on being the final word now looked more like arrogance than authority. Even former allies distanced themselves, careful not to be caught defending his contradictions. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett's star was rising. Cable networks that once relegated her to brief sound bites now booked her for extended segments. App-heads praised her discipline, her grounding in lived experience, and her ability to translate complex constitutional law into plain speech. Grassroots organizers hailed her as proof that authenticity could triumph over pedigree. Within days, fundraisers she was associated with saw spikes in donations. Commentators began calling her the breakout voice of accountability. What struck people most wasn't just her command of the law, it was her composure, the media landscape fueled. By shouting matches, Crockett's calm dismantling stood out. She hadn't matched Dershowitz's volume. She hadn't tried to humiliate him with theatrics. She'd simply shown the receipts, trusted the audience to see the contradictions, and let the truth speak. It was, as one columnist wrote, the rare political moment that felt both unscripted and historic. Back on social media, the memes kept multiplying. One viral tweet read, "Harvard degree, $70,000 a year, Crockett's clapback, priceless." Another posted a screenshot of Dershowitz's stunned face with the caption, "The exact moment he realized she came with footnotes." By week's end, Crockett's office was flooded with interview requests, invitations to panels, and even calls from late-night hosts hoping to bring her on. The irony was unmistakable. Dershowitz had entered the debate intending to lecture a younger opponent into submission. Instead, he had elevated her into national prominence. handing her a platform larger than any campaign ad could have purchased. But Crockett wasn't finished. Because while social media celebrated the clapback and pundits dissected Dershowitz's fall from grace, she had one more card to play. Her closing words, delivered with the same quiet force as her rebuttal, carried a lesson bigger than any single debate, or even any single career. And that final lesson was about to transform a viral moment into something much deeper. As the viral moment settled into the national consciousness, something remarkable happened. Jasmine Crockett refused to make it about herself. In interviews, when asked how it felt to take down Alan Dershowitz, she shook her head. About who won a debate, she told MSNBC, "It's about whether we take the Constitution seriously, or treat it like a tool to protect the powerful." Her words reframed the confrontation. No longer a generational clash, no longer a soundbite war. It became a deeper meditation on democracy itself. The Constitution, she said in one widely shared interview, doesn't belong to Harvard, professors, or cable news pundits. It doesn't even belong to Congress alone. It belongs to every American, every worker, every parent, every student, every person who's ever had to rely on the promise of equal justice. The line landed like thunder. Commentators replayed it as the distilled essence of the entire debate. Hashtags like #OurConstitution and #ForThePeople began to trend alongside the original. #Crockett Clapback. Crockett's reframing cut through the noise because it offered something rare: clarity. Where Dershowitz had leaned on pedigree and shifting arguments, she offered a reminder that law, at its best, was supposed to be steady, principled, and accessible. She drew the contrast without ever saying his name. When we treat law like a game of who can argue best on TV, she told a local radio station in Texas, we forget its purpose. The law is supposed to shield the vulnerable, not serve as a weapon for the already powerful. Her tone wasn't scolding, but resolute. She transformed a viral clash into a civics lesson that people actually wanted to hear, and the lessons resonated on multiple levels. Truth greater than arrogance. Crockett showed that facts, calmly presented, will outlast swagger. Service greater than legacy. Her lived experience defending vulnerable clients gave her credibility no resume line could match. Dignity greater than dismissal.
Ow.
By refusing to meet condescension with rage, she elevated the tone and won the room. Each theme became a rallying cry for audiences hungry for leaders who embodied more than talking points. In classrooms, professors explained how her composure illustrated the importance of ethos and argument. In community centers, organizers replayed her words as an example of leadership grounded in service. In living rooms, ordinary viewers saw someone who not only held her own but held firm to principle. The emotional payoff was undeniable. Crockett became more than just the protagonist of a viral clip. She became a symbol of principled resilience in an age of performative politics. She reminded people that dignity could be a form of power, and then, just as the nation began to move on, believing the moment had run its course, one final twist emerged, a twist that would seal the exchange's place not just in the news cycle but in history. Alan Dershowitz entered that studio certain of his superiority. He had the pedigree, the decades of airtime, the aura of untouchability. But in one unforgettable exchange, his smirk gave way to silence, dismantled by a woman he had tried to dismiss. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a debate. She proved that knowledge, preparation, and principle can bend even the loudest voices into quiet. Her calm command of the law, sharpened by years defending those without power, exposed the hollowness of arrogance dressed up as expertise. And that is why this moment matters. It wasn't just about Dershowitz or Crockett. It was about who gets to define the Constitution. It was about reminding America that truth is stronger than theatrics, that dignity can disarm dismissal, and that sometimes the underdog doesn't just fight back, she changes the conversation entirely. For millions watching, Crockett became more than a panelist. She became a reminder that courage still matters, that preparation still matters, that principles still matter. She showed that when arrogance meets authenticity, arrogance loses, and that is the lesson worth carrying forward. If moments like this inspire you, if you believe in battles where truth silences arrogance and underdogs rise to redefine history, then you're in the right place. Hit subscribe to stay with us as we uncover more stories where dignity defeats dismissal, where power is held accountable, and where voices like Jasmine Crockett's remind us all what resilience looks like, because sometimes all it takes is one steady voice to prove that courage is contagious.